Finding a framework within which we can adequately recognize our social nature and the manner in which we are not independent of one another is difficult, and it must be said is still work in progress. We've just reviewed two approaches, theory and simulation theory, in which it's assumed that social cognition is a kind of a problem that is solved by an individual who is excluded from the other person, for whom the other person is, as it were, something to be figured out. We're now going to take a very brief look at a third alternative. This is called participatory sense-making, and here priority will be given not to what's going on inside a person, but what's going on between people. And this technical term, participatory sense-making, comes from a field known as enaction, E-N-A-C-T-I-O-N. Enaction is a scientific and philosophical approach grounded in biology and not in psychology. It's also sometimes known as mind and life, because its basic premise is that many of these difficult questions we've been encountering should be best understood not by positing a discrete individual cogito, Descartes' solution, but rather regarding the qualitative aspect of mind as being inherent in life itself. So this approach does not make a special case of humans. It acknowledges that living beings have a certain something about them which makes their lives intrinsically meaningful. Here, the focus is always on interaction rather than on trying to characterize some being as if they had any existence outside of context. Every living being preserves its identity over time by regulated interactions with its environment, however we care to characterize the environment. So the nature of one's relation to the world on enaction, which falls under the larger class of embodied approaches, is more like a handshake. One is always in interaction with the world. Shown there on the right is a little bit of shorthand, where the circle refers to that closed set of processes that constitute the biological individual, but not entirely closed, because that organization is only possible through regulated exchange with the environment, which is shown by those two arrows and the wavy line. And we should understand organism and environment in the most general and abstract terms here. Now, when we start down this road, and we can only take the briefest of glances today, a lot of the conceptual difficulties of approaching perception that arise in psychological approaches are replaced to a great extent here by a single term, sense-making. Now, sense-making does not separate perception from action, doesn't assume that an organism or an animal or a person can be understood as an input-output system. Rather, sense-making is the process whereby a meaningful world arises in the regulated coupling of an agent with its environment. This comes out of the strongly biological and philosophical recognition that animals, creatures with different kinds of bodies, will encounter different kinds of worlds. An earthworm's world, the world that arises for an earthworm, is nothing like your world. It doesn't contain tables and teapots. So that's the basic definition of sense-making, so that the world that you encounter, the qualitative world that you encounter, arises in the regulated coupling of you with your environment. But remember, for humans, the most important element in their environment are other humans who are also understood as sense-makers. In this way, the sense-making that gives rise to your world and the sense-making that gives rise to my world become entangled in each other. The diagram on the right shows you this. The sense-making of each of those two systems is now seen to arise through regulated interaction, not just with an inert environment, the environment here is never inert, but also with other sense-makers. So this emphasizes the reciprocity of our being in the world, and it doesn't allow us to carve up the picture that we create here into discrete individual minds. In this way, subjects are not distinct and isolated, but rather we understand them as being necessarily also socially constituted. This approach is relatively recent. It's only about 30 years old, but its history could be seen to be much older than that, for it addresses concerns that, as we've seen, have caused problems for hundreds of years. You may be sitting here wondering, how could I possibly conceive of my mind as being anything other than separate and discrete from everyone else's mind? Now, that question arises largely if you're sitting on your own. If you're sitting together with someone else, then you are collectively making sense of the situation and everything changes. I'd like to give you a little analogy, and this is just a cartoon to try to give you a sense for how something can be both recognizable as singularly constituted and also be recognized as having no independent existence. Okay, the music is a bit ridiculous. There's some nice soap bubbles. And if we blow into the middle, little conjuring trick, here's a square soap bubble. They said it couldn't be done. Right, that square soap bubble exists. You can see it there. It's a square soap bubble. You could describe it as having its own properties. And yet, when you look at how its mode of existence, you find there's nothing about that square soap bubble that is independent of all the other bubbles around it. So that's just to give you a sort of an intuitive feel for how we might loosen our assumptions about our independence from the world when we adopt a strongly relational and interactional approach. We don't have time to pursue this in any detail in this module because it requires such a fundamental shift in attitude. I will be teaching a module in the second trimester on embodied and enactive approaches, Comp 40280, and cognitive science students and other interested parties are welcome to take part, and there we will explore these kinds of alternatives in much greater detail.